The Intruder by John Lockyer, Chapters 3 and 4. Chapter 3, Tracks in the Dust. Moonbase, July 12. Priority, something is out there. End. Throughout the day, the scanners logged constant tremors in the outer west trigon. Luca's routine changed. He didn't go back to the domes that afternoon. Apart from a few short breaks to eat and stretch his cramped limbs, he stayed in the control room, in front of the camstick screen, watching. The time between the alerts became shorter. Luca tried desperately to work out what was causing the shakes. Over and over again, he wished that he had contact with the D4. Its satellites, with their light, motion and heat detectors, would have identified the disturbance and relayed the information to the moon-based control room. But the data couldn't get beyond the damaged relay station, so Luca worked with the facts that he had. He wrote them down. Outer West Trigon, terrain disturbance, tremor, regular sequence. Again, it was the regular sequence that nagged at him. If the tremor were a moonquake, then the quake's aftershocks would be getting further apart, not closer together. What about mine explosions? He'd searched the base files and found the month's blasting schedules. There were no blasts scheduled over this period, and he was sure that shuttles weren't to blame either. He'd made a quick trip to the spaceport's observation deck. He'd watched 3 shuttles lift off. The departures were a few minutes apart. He'd felt no tremors. So what was it? He swiveled in his chair, back and forth, back and forth. Once again, a shadow of an idea teased his mind. Perhaps the regular sequence and the shorter time between alerts were connected. He swiveled in his chair again, and suddenly slapped the desktop. "Of course!" he shouted. Amazon, dozing on the top edge of the doorway, jerked awake, squawked and flitted from the room. The swinging of his chair, a regular sequence, had reminded Luca that the camstick and the sensors were swivelling too. Sweeping across the ocean of dust, they saw, felt and heard everything. For now, they could only feel the tremor. It was too far away to see or hear it. But it was getting closer, and Luca could prove it. He grabbed a blunt marker and a small board. Amazon glided back into the room, landed beside the board and watched him sketch. Luca drew a shape like a searchlight and its spreading beam. In the middle of the widest part of the beam, he drew a line of crosses down to the face of the searchlight. He wrote Moonbase beside the searchlight and Tremor beside the crosses. Then he pointed to the drawing. "It's simple, Amazon. The security sensors scan from one side of the trigon to the other. If something is here," he pointed to a cross at the top of the beam, "then the alerts are far apart because it takes longer for the sensors to move across the trigon." He tapped across closer to the searchlight's face. "But if something is here, then the sensors are closer together because the sensors take hardly any time to move across the trigon." Amazon looked at the sketch and then looked at Luca as if he understood everything. But Luca knew that he'd only come back for food. He reached into a compartment under the screens and pulled out a small sack. He flicked seeds from the sack onto the desk. Amazon bobbed about, pecking at them. Luca swiveled in his chair again. He was pleased with himself, even though he still didn't have any idea what was causing the tremors. And he wouldn't know that until whatever it was came into view on the camstick. He didn't have long to wait. By early evening, the time between the alerts had shortened to an hour. And then, as the day's light slowly faded and shrouded the domes in inky darkness, the blinking alert lights flashed from yellow to red and a shrill siren sounded throughout the base. Luca was in the living pod, making his meal. Fresh caracorns from one of the domes and lumpy protein, which melted into juicy meat under microwaves, when he heard the alarm. He knew exactly what it meant. Dropping the hot dish and spilling the gloopy food across the galley bench, he raced along the link corridor and slid into the control room. The West Trigon camstick screen was the only lit monitor. Lockyer hit the red light on the desk panel. The siren broke off. He touched a pad. The picture on the screen stopped scrolling. Some coordinates appeared in the top right corner. 49 West. He'd been right. The visual range of the camstick was 50 kilometres. Whatever was causing the tremors had just entered the West Trigon visual zone. He moved his finger slowly over the pad. The camstick scrolled to the right. He leaned forward, squinting at the screen, trying to see anything. It was difficult. Daylight was almost gone. Lucas skipped over the left side of the Trigon. It was dead flat. The dust there was just a few centimetres thick. Anything unusual would have been instantly visible. He moved the camstick across the right side of the Trigon. He could see 4 small craters. Their edges rose up sharply, tall and smooth. Lockyer tracked the camstick over the first crater, and then the second crater and the third. Nothing. Then, just as the last shafts of light were turning to gloom, he saw it, on the edge of the 4th crater, between 2 crumbling rocks. It was about 30 centimetres long and 15 centimetres across, wider at the front than the back. 8 rippled ridges stood up like the nodules on an alligator's back. A boot print. Chapter 4. The Intruder. Moonbase, July 13. Priority. An unidentified intruder has entered the inner West Trigon. End. Lockyer glanced at his timepiece. It was well after midnight. For hours he'd sat in front of the screen, manoeuvring the camstick and seeing nothing more. Night on the moon was dark. So dark that the landscape was invisible. The eerie blackness soaked into every rock and grain of dust. He ran his finger back and forth over the swivel pad, wondering who or what was the intruder. Where had it come from? And what did it want? He had questions, but no answers. Once again, he silently cursed the damaged relay satellite. He needed help from D4. And then, he had a sudden thought. Perhaps the intruder was part of his training. Perhaps D4 had deliberately cut off moon-based communication and faked a threat to its security just to see how he handled himself. Lucas shook his head. That was crazy. If something went wrong and food production was interrupted, then people on Earth would starve like they had in the 20th and 21st centuries. Earth administrators would never let that happen. Lucas decided to wait and watch. He wouldn't suit up. He wouldn't go outside. He wouldn't meet or greet the intruder. He would decide what to do only after he knew if the intruder was a friend or an enemy. He yawned and shook his head. There was nothing to do until the intruder showed itself. He left the control room. Lucas couldn't sleep. He wandered the living pod corridors, thinking and worrying. He also tried reactivating the communication satellite. Halfway through a basic procedure, he remembered that the fault was with receiving data and not transmitting it. Any correction had to be made by a maintenance crew from Earth. He couldn't believe he'd forgotten such an important fact. Shrugging, he closed the procedure and started his dome round early. By the time night had melted from black to ghostly grey, he was back in the control room. He watched as first the crater's sharp, raised edges, and then the surrounding dust desert, and lastly the crater bowl itself, emerged from shadow. An hour passed before there was enough light to see the single trail of boot prints. Lucas tracked them carefully until they disappeared. Fingering the swivel pad, he tried to alter the camstick angle, but the trail had vanished into a blind spot, some sort of overhanging rock shelf. He leaned back in his chair and wiped his top lip. He felt small beads of sweat. "We'll wait," he said. Whatever it is, it has to come out sometime. Perched on his shoulder, Amazon nodded as if in agreement, and then he fluttered down to the desk and gobbled a couple of seeds that Luca had scattered there earlier. Luca stared at the screen. He supposed the Intruder would have a variable gravity suit. It'd be able to move quickly, a few kilometres every few minutes, or slowly, the way that someone might walk on Earth. Questions again filled his mind. Where had the Intruder come from? Earth? Probably not. An Earthship would have landed at the spaceport, where there was instant access to a dome. An alien? Possible. Luca knew that the base lights could be seen from thousands of kilometres away in space, but his system's checks told him that all lunar force fields were intact. Any unauthorised activity in a field would immediately activate a D-Force Space Vader fleet. So that left the mine. Luca nodded. All the signs seemed to suggest that the Intruder came from there. The mine was in the outer west trigon. With the right equipment, an Intruder could walk to the base in a day. And, apart from the base, the mine was the only place on the moon that had been colonised by humans. But Luca knew that there weren't any there now. There hadn't been any since the day papal mining began. There was no need for them. The machines did everything. Luca had seen the mine machines up close on screen. They weren't like other machines. They were alive, living things all doing different jobs. The large machines did the heavy work below the dusty surface. Deep inside the thick veins of papal, they jerked, pulled, rolled, dug, scraped, blasted and sorted the precious mineral. The small machines worked on the surface, refining, dissolving, mixing, purifying and storing the papal. When a big machine broke down, a small machine fixed it. And if a small machine broke down, well, then it fixed itself. Left to themselves, the machines were fast, efficient, continually improving and clever. Way too clever. Luca shivered. It was an odd feeling to have, but he didn't like the machines. They were unreal. He tapped the desk, impatient, nervous, and he thought, if the machines could copy themselves, repair themselves and improve themselves, what was to stop them from designing brand new machines? Machines that had nothing to do with the base. Dangerous machines. Luca shivered again and then touched the swivel pad and rotated the camstick. The full sun lit up the moon. On the screen, everything in and around the crater was calm and quiet. He shifted in his seat and caught a glimpse of himself reflected in one of the blank screens. His face looked gaunt, his hair scraggly. The whites of his eyes seemed too large. He shook his head, trying to clear a faint dizziness. He was tired. Amazon flapped up and settled on his shoulder. Luca turned and stroked him under the beak. But instead of chirping, Amazon clucked sharply and nodded at the screen. Luca turned and then froze. The siren was disarmed, but the red light was flashing. Something was moving in the crater. Luca jerked forward, sending Amazon swooping around the room. He hit the camstick swivel pad and something bright yellow swamped the screen. Luca maxed out the camstick. There it was, the Intruder, in full view. He saw a figure dressed in a bulky outfit made of shiny yellow fabric. The Intruder's gloves and boots were huge, almost out of proportion to its body. Its helmet had narrow slits for eye holes, and a fat rucksack hung awkwardly on its back. Luca watched the Intruder scramble out of the crater, dust itself off, and stride towards the base. It walked clumsily, with plodding, lumpy, mechanical steps. As it moved, it swung its head from side to side, searching, scanning. Every so often Luca caught a glimpse of flashing, steely eyes. Once again, he felt a chill run through his body.